Welcome to this explainer. So if you keep tabs on UK politics, you've definitely heard of the Fabian Society. But recently, the chatter around this 140-year-old left-wing think tank has really reached a fever pitch. Today, we're unpacking a pretty fierce media debate. Are the Fabians just your standard policy incubator? Or, as some critics argue, a covert ideological cabal quietly pulling the strings behind the scenes? Here's what we're looking at today. We'll kick things off with the Cabal controversy, then trace the alleged institutional connections, examine the threat of gradualism, hear out the think tank defense, and finally zoom out to the wider influence debate. Part 1. The Cabal controversy, a joke or a confession? It all kicked off at a recent Fabian Society conference. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was at the podium and jokingly called the group a not-so-secret cabal going from strength to strength. Now, supporters, they just saw this as a bit of lighthearted banter, nodding to the society's long, very open history in left-wing politics. But conservative critics absolutely pounced on that phrase. For commentators on the right, this wasn't a joke at all. They saw it as a brazen confession. The argument is, if an organization that's been around for 140 years literally calls itself a cabal, well, the public is entirely entitled to ask, a cabal of what exactly? And exercising power over whom? And to answer that question, critics point straight to the group's foundational methodology, Fabian socialist gradualism. The thinking here is that the Fabians don't operate like radical revolutionaries. You are never going to catch them organizing riots in the streets or demanding overnight regime change. No, their strategy relies on patient, step-by-step institutional embedding over decades. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, the accusation is that this ideological network steadily embeds itself into the very structures of the state using a highly methodical approach. It goes like this. They secure a seat on one advisory board at a time. They publish one influential policy paper at a time. They forge one corporate or governmental collaboration at a time until eventually it leads to one piece of national legislation at a time. Critics argue that because this happens so quietly, so procedurally, the general public doesn't even realize a major ideological shift is taking place until it is already firmly locked into law. Moving on to Part 2, tracing institutional connections and mapping this alleged network. Right, so critics are really ringing alarm bells over a specific web of connections here. First up, you have the City of London Corporation, the absolute financial heart of the UK. Their policy chairman recently boasted about openly collaborating with and even hosting the Fabians. Then you've got the Bank of England. Now, it's supposed to be entirely independent, completely free of political ideology, right? Yet the current governor, Andrew Bailey, actually chaired the Fabian Society back at university. And finally, there's the Office for Investment. This is a body set up in conjunction with the Chancellor, who, as it happens, is also connected to the Fabians. For critics, this is clear-cut proof of an ideological network operating deep inside the machinery of state finance and regulation. They argue it makes the idea of true institutional independence just a meaningless technical label. And just to put into perspective, the sheer scale of what's at stake here, critics point directly to that Office for Investment we just talked about. This collaborative effort between the government, regulators, and the City of London is set to unlock £10 billion in inward investment. That is a massive sum. The argument is simple. When an organization has direct ties to the people managing £10 billion of international finance, it is no longer just some humble think tank scribbling pamphlets in a back room. No, it's a group with its hands directly on the levers of national power. Which brings us to Part 3, the threat of gradualism. Let's look at historical symbols and modern manifestos. During the recent broadcast debate, conservative panelist Jane Stevenson brought up a fascinating bit of PR history. She pointed out that a former logo associated with the society was literally a wolf in sheep's clothing, which, let's be honest, is not exactly subtle if you're trying to dodge accusations of stealth and disguise. She then noted their shift to the current symbol, which is a turtle. It's a literal rebrand, sure, but Stevenson argues it perfectly symbolizes their core strategy: slow, steady, relentless movement. For critics, these symbols aren't just quirky history. They're basically admissions of guilt, proving an intent to quietly infiltrate the civil service without ever drawing attention. And look, it isn't just ancient history or symbolic logos that have people talking. Critics argue that the Fabian Society is a very real, present-day threat precisely because they openly boast about their modern influence. At their recent conference, leadership talked freely about incubating some of the most transformative policies in the country, everything from the minimum wage to the NHS, and they took credit for shaping a huge chunk of the 2024 Labor Manifesto. Critics are saying, hey, if you are writing the policies that become national law, you absolutely must be subjected to intense public scrutiny. Okay, Part 4. The think tank defense, a centrist incubator. So the big question is, how do defenders of the Fabian Society actually counter these intense, sweeping allegations? Well, former Labor Minister Bill Ramel fiercely pushed back on the broadcast, offering a completely different perspective. Where critics see this shadowy ideological network operating inside the machinery of state, Ramel basically calls the entire panic hyperhyped and totally exaggerated. He argues the Fabian Society is simply a centrist think tank. Yes, it seeks to develop and influence policy, but that is literally exactly what think tanks are designed to do. Crucially, he argues, it fundamentally does not dictate policy, and it certainly doesn't operate in secret. Ramel points straight to the historical timeline to back this up. Yes, they were created way back in 1884 alongside the Labour Party to shape the left. But look at the volatile 1980s. The Fabians weren't these radical instigators. They actually acted as a crucial, moderating bulwark against the hard left. They were the centrist adults in the room. Fast forward to 2024, and Ramel argues they continue to function simply as an open policy incubator. They host conferences, they write papers, they aren't forcing secret legislation through Parliament. This defense was strongly backed up by the Society's honorary treasurer, Paul Richards, whose statement was read on air. He points out that, yes, the group provides ideas and policies, and sure, it is naturally affiliated with Labour, which totally explains why Labour politicians attend their events. It's just viewed as a highly respected place for politicians to write and publish. But here's the absolute critical distinction. The Fabian Society possesses crucially no collective policy. There is no hive mind manifesto that every single member is forced to enact. They are, at the end of the day, merely a marketplace of ideas for the left. Let's wrap things up with part 5. The influence debate, democracy, and think tanks. Ultimately, this entire debate really transcends the Fabian Society itself. On one side of the aisle, you have this strict demand for accountability. If a pressure group is out there training ministers, collaborating with financial hubs, and shaping national legislation, critics say they need to be scrutinized just as heavily as the politicians we actually elect. But on the flip side, defenders argue that open think tanks are the absolute lifeblood of a healthy, functioning democratic society. I mean, we want people actively gathering to debate and shape policy. The real friction here lies in those blurred lines. At what point does a totally normal collaborative relationship between a think tank and a supposedly independent state body cross the line into inappropriate ideological influence? Which brings us to our ultimate takeaway for this explainer. We've heard the accusations of a covert network, and we've heard the defense of it being an open incubator. So I want to leave you with this really provocative question to chew on. In a complex modern government that is just absolutely teeming with advisors, boards, and policy papers, how much influence should an unelected think tank realistically have? When the dust settles, who is really in charge of Britain's future? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the structures around you.